Well, good evening. We want to welcome each and every one of you that are joining us tonight as we are here together. I appreciate you coming and joining a seat at the table with Dr. Paul Murray. I'm really happy to have with me tonight some very outstanding individuals to really talk about the issue of this pandemic and mental health with an explicit focus on students and their families. You know, from school closings to virtual graduations, the stress and the uncertainty surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic presents daily challenges to mental health and well-being of children, teenagers, and even young adults from elementary school right up through university. And that also has a direct impact on the family as a whole. The coronavirus pandemic has really affected us in many ways, physically, emotionally, economically, socially, and even psychologically. So we are dealing with a disruption of our lives. There's fear of serious disease, there's uncertainty, there's isolation, and all of these issues are having an impact. And as we're closing out a virtual school year, we're seeing the impact that it really is having on families. So this evening, I want to just move right into this. And as everyone joins us tonight, we're happy to take your questions. You can just go ahead and post them, and we will make sure that we answer any questions that you have. And we'll be providing some toll-free hotline numbers for you. Everything that we share with you tonight, please know that we want to direct you to the proper place, and know that none of us are here as licensed clinicians to say to you, this is absolutely just for you. We're going to refer you to an 800 numbers. We're going to refer you to your local physicians that can give you resources. And even my panelists tonight can even refer you to places that will help you and your families. So without further ado, I want to first introduce you to Kelsey Buchanan. Kelsey, if you'd say hello.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelsey. Nice to meet you all. Excited to have a conversation tonight.
Thank you, Kelsey. Kelsey serves as a secondary school counselor for the Alexandria City Public School System, where she primarily serves students in the AVID program. She's a DMV, as we call DC, Maryland, and Virginia native, growing up in Northern Virginia. And Kelsey is in her 4th year as a school counselor. She is highly experienced in developing accommodations with students who have a 504 plan, assisting students in the individualized education program, conducting suicide risk assessments, and monitoring at-risk students. Ms. Buchanan is a national certified counselor. She holds her master's in school counseling from George Washington University and a bachelor in human services from the University of Delaware. So we're so glad to have you with us, Kelsey, tonight. Our next panelist is Teresa Gordon. Teresa, would you say hello this evening?
Hello, good evening, everybody. I'm thankful to be here.
Thank you. Now, Teresa is a committed servant. She's an educator, an advocate for youth and families whose professional career as a licensed school psychologist spans more than 25 years. She holds a Master of Science degree in school psychology from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology and sociology from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. Mrs. Gordon has also received extensive graduate level training in counseling, and she is a certified instructor in youth mental health first aid and restorative practices. Now, over the years, Mrs. Gordon has delivered psychoeducational services to students of all ages and demographics across a really diverse range of public schools, as well as in private practice. As an educational leader, Mrs. Gordon has developed and taught numerous courses. She's led various mental health and educational initiatives and provided training and consultative services to a myriad of parents, businesses, community agencies, and churches. I like the personal part of Teresa. She is the blessed wife of more than 20 years and a proud mother to a high school son. And Mrs. Gordon is an active member of her church and relies upon her faith in God to guide all of her endeavors. Mrs. Gordon's greatest desire is to use her God-given abilities in loving service to those standing in the need of hope and healing. If asked really to capitalize the view that she holds about every person that she meets, Mrs. Gordon would simply reply, "You matter." I like that. Again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, Teresa. And finally, but definitely not least, I want to introduce you to Michaela Tucker. Michaela, would you say hello to our audience?
Hi, good evening, everyone. So glad to be a part of this, and thank you for having me on tonight.
Now, thank you, Michaela. Michaela serves also as a secondary school counselor in Alexandria, Virginia, where she attends to a caseload of students split between two campuses. She has served in a variety of counseling and teaching roles for the past 6 years and has a heart and a passion assisting young people. Some of her experiences include previously serving as a mental health counselor intern, where she utilized cognitive behavioral therapy strategies with children in a therapeutic day treatment program who had ADHD, autism, anger management, and other mental health issues to alter negative behaviors. In addition, she has served and provided support for young people in Nicaragua and families entering the United States as refugees from a variety of countries. She currently counsels students in both individual and small group sessions to assist them with issues that affect their social, emotional well-being, and also their academics. She attends to crisis responses to assist students with a variety of mental health concerns and makes appropriate referrals to outside mental health providers when necessary. And finally, Michaela supports students with specialized interventions and services through organizing and also conducting 504 accommodation meetings and attendance and input in individualized education program meetings. Mrs. Tucker, she earned her Master's of Education in School Counseling from Liberty University and is currently working toward earning her license in professional counseling. She also earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Texas Christian University with a dual minor in Spanish and Hispanic Studies and History. And Michaela challenges others to overcome the notion that you must be regular because it robs you of the chance to be extraordinary. So, Michaela, we're so glad to have you here and each and every one of you. And let me just start off right now and saying that if you're joining us tonight and you're in a place of anxiety, I want you to see that we're going to be periodically putting online the 800 assistant numbers that you can reach out to. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. And also, if you're on here, especially in this time where we're quarantined into our own homes, domestic abuse and domestic violence is on a rise, unfortunately. And we have an 800 number for you also. If you need that number, it's 1-800-799-7233. Or you can just text LOVEIS to 22522. So having said all of that, let me go ahead and move right into our esteemed guest this evening and begin with Kelsey. Kelsey, I want to ask you in this opening question here, how can we label this pandemic from a mental health perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of how you introduced it, it's an area where our lives are disrupted, and anytime that things happen and change for a lot of people causes anxiety, causes depression. And so just having things, unfortunately, out of our control and being disrupted kind of causes those feelings of anxiety deep down. And so just kind of highlighting those in this time, also realizing that those may have already been there and now are just starting to find its root and finding a little more to hold on to.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Let me turn that question over to Teresa. Teresa, when we are looking at where we are right now, how can we label this pandemic from a mental health perspective?
I think we have to look at it as a traumatic event. Trauma is something that threatens a person. They feel unsafe. And so I think when we consider all of the impacts that this pandemic is having, some of them are yet to be revealed. But certainly safety is a concern facing many young people and adults. So much uncertainty around the virus itself, when it will end, when there will be a cure. And so all of that combined with the loss of life I think you can only really describe it as, well, that would be my description, would be a traumatic event.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And finally, Michaela, if you could also address that question, how can we label this pandemic from a mental health perspective?
Sure. So I think Kelsey and Teresa have really said it pretty well in that, oftentimes when we go through change in different situations, it brings about a lot more anxiety, depression. It also kind of goes back to the way that we cope and handle life situations. And so oftentimes when we're experienced with a traumatic event, we find ourselves going back to the way that we would have coped with a traumatic event when we were younger, or how we learned how to cope with events in different situations. And so I think this isolation, especially of ourselves, has brought out a lot of things that we may not have not necessarily discovered about ourselves, or necessarily have realized that it was something that we were dealing with. And so I think it's just really interesting to see how all of us are learning to cope with ourselves, cope with the people that we love, cope with the people we live with, and just coping with this, like Teresa had said, this traumatic event that's occurred. And I think one of the important things too is to understand that we're not alone in this situation. And I think that's one of the hardest things when you are in isolation, is that you begin to feel alone. And so I definitely think that through this pandemic, we hopefully can kind of grasp with others and realize that we're all experiencing this together in some way, shape, or form.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much. That's a very good analysis that each of you have brought forward this evening. And I think that when we're looking at this as an issue, this is a crisis right now that we're all facing globally and nationally, and every family up and down our street is looking at this as the same issue. And we also understand that it's not just this issue, but that we can have crises that will happen in the future. So I'm hoping tonight that as we discuss this, that what applies to today can also apply into the future. So that moves me into another question that, often when we talk about it, we find that people don't really want to talk about what mental health really is. And so my question to each of you is, what is mental health, and why is it considered a taboo? And I think I'll start with you, Teresa. What is mental health, and also why are people so afraid of it?
When I think of the definition of mental health, I think of it as a combination of our thoughts, our feelings, our behavioral response to the situation. And so it's really all of that together. I personally like to think of mental health on a continuum like you would physical health. So you can be mentally well and you can be mentally unwell, just like with physical health. If you had were presenting with some symptoms of diabetes, there might be some things that you could do before you became sick. You might be presenting some of the early signs, but you could do some interventions that would move you back to wellness. And so I like to think of mental health in the same way, that you can be mentally well, functioning well throughout your life, or you could have some challenges that bring you closer to being unwell. You might not have a diagnosis, but there are some interventions that you do that can bring you back to balance more in the wellness range. And so when we think about what would make it taboo, you mentioned taboo, I guess I think of that as stigma. And, a lot of people have preconceived ideas, maybe even some negative experiences around mental health or mental challenges, maybe people in their family, maybe in generationally speaking, there has been some misunderstanding or some myths around mental health. And so it can carry stigma. You see a lot of negative depictions of people who have mental challenges in media. Even in the faith community, sometimes there is not an acceptance that this is a real thing. And so I think all of that can be stigmatized when it comes to mental health.
Sure, I appreciate that. Michaela, when we think of mental health, what are some of the identifiers of mental health? When we say mental health, what exactly are we talking about?
Sure. So mental health it basically consists of, your emotional, your psychological, and your social well-being. Ultimately, the health of your mental status, basically, right? It affects how we think, how we feel, and ultimately how we act. And it can determine how we handle stress, how we relate to others, and how we make decisions, and make choices. And I think it's really interesting. I love what Teresa talked about when she says, there's this stigma in regards to taboo. And, I find it so fascinating how, especially when I think about the US in particular, there's this notion of, if you have mental health illness, it is something of you being crazy, or if you are wanting to talk to somebody, that means that something is wrong with you. And that's not necessarily the case. And I think there's that stigma that people have. And like Teresa had said, it can go back to, how you grew up, your family, culturally. I found it so interesting when when I traveled to Argentina and even in Nicaragua. When I went to those countries, it was fascinating to me how I was considered crazy for not talking to somebody, and not having a psychologist or a therapist or someone who could help me work out a lot of the situations that I was dealing with. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, when you are trying to address mental health, like Teresa said, it's almost the same thing as a physical ailment. And just like a doctor can't necessarily immediately heal your broken leg, right? But with working with strategies with you in conversation, it's like having an outside viewer looking into your situation. And so I think when it comes to mental health, it's extremely important to have that outside view, because sometimes we don't always see what is right in front of us. So.
Excellent. Kelsey, when I think of mental health too, I think of some words that when we describe mental health. One thing is depression. Can you give me some other points that describe, when we talk about mental health, what are the categories that we're looking at?
Yeah, I would say depression, anxiety, those are kind of the first two that come to mind. But I also was thinking about just mental health and as it's passed down. And so thinking about it as a true illness, like there are people in your family that might have had instances of mental health concerns, and that is something that you can also have and kind of is genetically in you. And so kind of thinking about it, like we were all saying, from that aspect of a true illness, something that, is out of your control. So I think the whole concept of mental health, and kind of whatever form or whatever way you experience it, is an experience that happens when control is lost, and when someone feels as though they can't control those emotions, those thoughts, right, those actions.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I have one question that just came in. They want to know, is ADHD considered a mental health issue? Would like to pick that up. Go ahead, Teresa.
I don't mind speaking about that one. As you mentioned earlier, I teach youth mental health first aid, and that is a point of discussion that we have a lot when I've taught that class. ADHD is considered a mental disorder, but I think a lot of people have some difficulty with that description, with that label or that category. And the reason that it is considered a disorder, a mental health disorder, is because of the impact. When you think about a mental disorder, you're thinking of something that affects your thoughts, your behavior, your ability to carry out your regular activities throughout the day. So in the case of a young person, for example, one of their major activities they have to do is school. So when we think about ADHD and the neurobiological component and the impact that it has on executive functioning, which is thinking, organizing, planning, initiating things, finishing things, then you can kind of see how there is an impact on those areas that I mentioned earlier. So while it's a mental disorder, I think a lot of people struggle with it because um, lots of people have it. Lots of children have that diagnosis. Lots of adults have that diagnosis. And I think some people struggle with it being in the same realm as some of the other disorders. But again, revisiting stigma, if we can learn to move away from the stigma, then maybe that won't be such an issue.
Sure.
I also, if I could add too, I also think just like any other mental disorder, you know, there's a spectrum too that it can fall on. So, you know, someone could have ADHD and it be, you know, I have a hard time staying focused on certain topics, and it doesn't necessarily affect my, you know, everyday life. Whereas someone could have a more severe case of ADHD where, you know, it is more, it has a greater effect on their daily activities. And I think that comes with any mental disorder. So there's a span as well.
I think too, it can link to other things. And so just thinking about some of my kiddos in school that have ADHD, it is uncomfortable to be in the classroom, right? And so you want to look for a way to escape, a way to get up and move around and make yourself more useful in your mind. And so I think that comes with anxiety, that comes with being different and kind of putting yourself in an uncomfortable and new situation, leaving class and then coming back and feeling like you missed something, right? Which comes with that pressure. And so I think they all kind of go hand in hand.
Excellent, excellent. That's good. It kind of gives us an overview tonight as we're looking at mental health. Now, I want to draw us in a little bit to this current pandemic. And the question is, does isolation have an impact on an individual's own well-being when you're isolated like this? I'll open that up to any of you if you'd like to take that right now. Teresa?
Okay. Well, you know, we're talking a lot about isolation and social distancing. I guess my preference is to call it physical distancing. And the reason for that is, you know, we know that you can be physically apart from someone and not necessarily.
Looks like we just lost her there for a moment. She locked up on us, and welcome to technology. This is what happens when you're isolated. you even get shut down. But we'll go ahead and go back to Teresa when she gets back on. So why don't I go ahead and bring that question to you, Kelsey. What kind of impact does isolation have on an individual's well-being?
Yeah, I think the idea of isolation and social distancing kind of, in my mind anyway, promotes fear, and that idea that, you know, you need to be separated, it's for your well-being, it's safe, and just fear grows when you're in isolation, right? And so kind of being in a situation where there aren't many other thoughts around but your own, there aren't many other things to think about or do, kind of promotes and gives seed to fear to continue to grow kind of in your mind.
Sure, sure. Michaela, do you have anything to add to this?
Absolutely. So when you first asked the question, you know, does isolation have an impact on an individual's well-being? My answer automatically is absolutely. Right? We are not meant to be alone, right? As human beings, we are social people. I found it interesting when so many of my friends and colleagues were, you know, when they say, oh, well, I'm an introvert, so this is great. But introvert, right, you still have some type of interaction with whether it's a family member or someone who's close with you, and there's some type of physical interaction. And so I think this isolation is absolutely affecting everybody in one way, shape, or form. And again, that effect can come about in different ways because everybody is different. Everyone has a different experience of what isolation looks like. You know, I'm isolated with myself and my husband, whereas, you know, someone else may be isolated just by themselves. Someone may be isolated with their entire family, you know, 3 kids and their husband, and they're trying to juggle everything. So I think it definitely affects us in one way, shape, or form.
Okay. Excellent. Let me go back to Teresa. And Teresa, I want to for you to expound upon this specifically to students. When we look at isolation, what is this isolation doing to students right now?
I think for most young people, they're having an experience. Well, it's going to be an individual experience, but adolescence, if we think about that span between about 12 to 18, is the time when young people develop an interest to be together with each other. They have a preference to be with their peers more so than with their parents or siblings very often. And so being pulled away from your typical activities to be just with your family or just with your siblings, your family of origin, can have a pretty significant impact in terms of feeling connected. And so I think many of them may be struggling. We are trying our best to stay connected to students during this time. And some of them are reporting a range of emotions from boredom, sadness, confusion, kind of wondering when this is all going to end. Some are less responsive, which makes me think that they might be suffering a little bit more with some feelings of depression or loneliness. So it definitely can have an impact.
Okay,
just
great.
The pieces that I heard.
Yeah, that's good. And let me, expound upon that and to each of you. Let's look at students that are in high school right now, and in particular, seniors that are graduating right now. Their graduations are supposed to be taking place or have taken place, or supposed to have already taken place. What kind of impact is this having on them as here's that stepping stone that you have, and all of a sudden that stepping stone has been taken out from you. There's no big celebration. We can't even group together and have it. Everything's being done virtual. So Michaela and each of you, when you're dealing with students, how are you relating to them or connecting with them right now in this environment? And what are you hearing in particular with seniors?
So I think in particular with seniors, when all of this first happened, one of my seniors reached out to me and she sent me this link to a video of a college senior expressing her emotions of what this pandemic was now doing. And she basically was stating how she was mourning the loss of all of these experiences, this transition period, prom, graduation, these next steps that are oftentimes seen as they are a pivotal moment in a student's life, moving on from high school into whether it's college, whether it's a career, whether it's military. And without that stepping stone, in a sense, or that easy transition, sometimes I feel as though that students they have that sense of mourning and that loss. And I also think too, I think about our students who school is their safe place. What is that doing for our seniors who, and all students really, who they have that safe place, that safe adult, that safe space, whereas they may not find that at home, or all of their friends go to the school and now they can't talk with them anymore. And especially for our seniors, they're going to be leaving their friends because they're going out of state and they didn't get a good goodbye or some type of closure to their senior year. And so I do relate it to a sense of mourning, of a loss of their senior year.
Sure. Okay, good. I've got a couple of questions here. One of them from DeMarcus, and DeMarcus, we'll get to that just in a moment. But I have a comment and a question here from a parent who says that their kids are always texting on the phone, and even when they're together with their peers, they spend more time texting each other. So how is there really a difference between what they're going through right now and what they normally do?
Good question.
Would you like to answer that, Teresa?
When I think about it, I have a 17-year-old and he is always on a device, almost always. But I think the difference is that the face-to-face, even if you're not engaging with each other the entire time, is really irreplaceable. You know, we have so much nonverbal communication that happens. It's a huge part of our communication, so that even if I'm sitting side by side with someone and even with my husband, we're sitting side by side and we are both on our devices, there is something different about his presence compared to me doing that alone. Maybe it's the availability, you know, that with young people, when they're all together and they're texting or they're on their devices, there are those moments of, hey, look at this. So there's the exchange that's happening, even though the device has become a part of the communication.
So what you're saying is presence is vital to connection, and that even though they may be on their own devices, that presence brings community and brings assurance for them. Kelsey, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I think presence is definitely key, and just other experiences. I think at school and in places where they're having these other interactions, they're interacting with other people, that gives them things to talk about, to debrief, to kind of process together. And so when those moments are kind of lost, I think it does become this kind of isolation kind of mentality where it's like, well, what did you do today? Not much, just woke up, and so kind of just going through the little tasks or things that happen in their day rather than these life-changing or even, social interactions that they're going to have, and kind of talking through and debriefing those.
Excellent. Michaela, do you have anything you'd like to add to this point?
Sure. I also think too, it's a level of taking away someone's opportunity to make a choice. And it's almost as if, if I put a candy bar in front of you and it's just left there, right? If you don't want it, you don't want it. But the moment I tell you you cannot have it, it kind of makes things a little bit different. And so I think even though, we're on our devices, or students are on their devices all the time with their friends, the fact that they have been told that they cannot be in these social environments, and it's that choice is being taken away from them, I think it impacts you more the moment a choice is taken away from you.
Okay, excellent. Now let's move this from the student to the parents. What is this isolation? Is there a difference based on age with an elementary student versus a middle school student, high school, and a parent when it comes to this isolation? Do they all face the same kinds of emotions and feelings, or is it different based on age and position within the family? Let me turn that to Kelsey first.
Yeah, I think it is different based on age, and I'm like so impressed when I see people walking around with younger children. I'm like, go ahead. I know it's a lot of work. So I think it just comes with, with the less freedom that I think older students are feeling, and feeling like they can't do things, and that they are in this situation that they don't want to be in, and kind of leading to that boredom. Younger students are on the other spectrum, where they have, less freedom anyway, but now they have to be occupied for longer periods of time, right? They have to be more creative with how you choose to occupy them and teach them. And then their attention spans are just shorter. So it's hard for them to engage in things that might be happening at their school or their preschool. It's harder for them to kind of feel more structured, and for their parents to kind of provide that structure for them. So I definitely think there is a difference when it comes to being at home with different age students.
Sure. Teresa, Michaela, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Okay. I also think too, I think if you take it from the perspective of this pandemic being a traumatic event, it definitely impacts the age does affect its impact. I think about the study on the ACEs scores, right? Adverse childhood experiences. And you think about how trauma affects, younger age individuals are more susceptible to traumatic events, in the sense that it can alter their cognitive abilities more often than it would those that are into adulthood. And so I think when you consider that factor, it really does play a heavy role on our young people, whether, you know, from elementary to young adolescents to high school. I think the older you get, you begin to, not that it doesn't affect you, it still does, but you begin to become affected by the traumas and you learn to cope with it based on how you were raised or the environment in which you grew up in. And so I think that's where a big difference does come into play with how it's, how age affects how they experience this pandemic.
Okay, excellent, excellent. I appreciate that. DeMarcus has a question. He'd like to know what ways can we help and support people around us that may struggle with mental health issues. So why don't I turn that to Teresa first, and then Kelsey, if you could follow up on that. So what ways can we help and support people around us that may struggle with mental health issues?
The first thing that comes to mind is validate their experience. I think, again, sometimes we want to help people, but we inadvertently stigmatize them or dismiss their issues. And maybe we're trying to be helpful by saying, oh, that's not a big deal. Don't say that about yourself. Don't say you feel that way. When in fact, that can be dismissive. So one of the biggest tools that I learned in teaching youth mental health first aid is non-judgmental listening is one of the components of youth mental health first aid. And it's a communication skill, really. It's saying when someone is sharing something with you, we don't judge it. We consider it. We try to be empathetic. And I think that first step makes a huge difference if you're just trying to put yourself in this other person's shoes. Person is coming to you saying, I feel depressed, I feel suicidal, I'm having a hard time with fears and worries or anxieties. The first thing is to validate that. Tell me more, ask open-ended questions, don't dismiss them, be a listener. That would be my first suggestion. And beyond that, kind of holding on to people as they move through this process. Treating someone as you want to be treated. If someone needs an ear, an ear. If someone needs resources, help them find resources. Someone sometimes just the presence, just your presence, but just trying to be available.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Kelsey.
Yeah, I was going to say something so similar, just normalizing it and making it so it's okay. You know, I think in this time, it's okay to be feeling those kind of feelings and having mental health issues and concerns. And so I think just understanding that and normalizing it for the person, but also being someone that's there, that's present, that doesn't take away that support. And so is there to have that conversation or go on that walk or do things with that person so they can, feel like there is someone in their corner kind of advocating for their best interest. And then on top of all of that, just kind of reminding yourself and reminding that person to just extend grace, a little bit more grace to them, right? I think when we're in periods of mental health crisis, we're not acting in our sound mind, and that is why it's a crisis. So just giving them that grace to understand that they're going to make mistakes. They might say the wrong thing. They might, be overly emotional or not emotional enough, and that's okay, and giving them that room.
Excellent. Thank you. For those that have registered, you'll be receiving from us after this convening a list of resources that can help you to be better equipped to address these kinds of ways to be supportive. Also, there'll be information there for you on where to go if you need help yourself. If you have not registered and you're on Facebook Live and just connected through with us, just instant message us your first name and email address, and we will make sure that you get a copy of this too. We want to make sure you have the resources that can help you, whether you're a person that is in need or if you know someone that is in need. Again, remember our toll-free numbers that we're providing for you tonight on the list is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 1-800-273-8255. And then also the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 1-800 799-7233, or you can just text LOVEIS to 22522. So we want to make sure that you have that information there. Let me move right into the next question that deals with, are you seeing an increase in suicide during this pandemic? Do you think students are more apt to attempt suicide or fulfill that place of suicide?
I don't have any updated statistics, so I wouldn't want to say yes, there has been an increase. I know that there has been an increase in domestic violence. I know that being in close quarters, having these major changes, major life changes, has added a layer of stress to individuals and families. So I don't want to quote a statistic and say, yes, it's going up, but I will say that the impact of this pandemic is going to be generational. I really don't believe that we in 1 or 2 or 3 years and that there will be a full recovery. So I think we're in it for the long haul.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point for all of us to understand, is that when everything is open back up, it doesn't mean everything's over. There's still all of these underlying issues. And do you believe that this pandemic, this quarantine is really kind of bringing to light some issues that some people may have been struggling with or not even aware that they had these issues, and all of a sudden they're manifesting themselves now? Michaela?
Well, I definitely think that with every life experience, you experience a little bit more about yourself, and you discover more about who you are. And so because this is something that is so new to all of us, I think there is a part that we're discovering more about ourselves, how we cope with this, how we cope with trauma, how we cope with, different experiences. And so absolutely. Sometimes it's not necessarily that, oh, I knew I had this in me and now it's just becoming greater. No, it's just like in a relationship, you may not understand someone fully until you've experienced a lot more, events or life situations with them, because, different sides of them are going to come out. You're going to see different emotions. You're going to see different thought processes, etc. So I definitely think that people are discovering more about themselves throughout this pandemic and how they cope with different situations.
Excellent. Kelsey, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I think families are just looking different in this time. And so, like Michaela was saying, just kind of learning to adjust to what your new normal looks like. I don't think families were used to spending this much time together on a daily basis, right? And so now we've gone from doing school at home, doing church at home, all of these activities where we maybe had some other outside influence, now as just with our families. And so I think that's awesome. And I think it's showing us a lot and teaching us a lot. But I also think when situations maybe aren't ideal, it's also showing us maybe some negative things. And so maybe not necessarily, like we were saying, suicide numbers increasing, but those suicidal thoughts, those ideations, just feeling as though things are getting smaller and feeling more complicated around them.
Yes, 75 years ago, 100 years ago, everything centered around the family. And now we see where we find ourselves where we have to focus on the family. And I think that's really interesting. And one of the things, a coping mechanism that we've done in our own family, I think that's really brought family even together, is utilizing this type of form of Zoom. And every week our family gets together, our extended family, my in-laws, my nephews and nieces and cousins and brothers and sisters-in-laws. And we've been having weekly Zoom chats, and we plan to get on for just an hour, but there are some weeks we're on 3-4 hours just having a blast. And when you hang up, there's such a release and such a comfort, because we've never connected like that. Usually it's just the holidays, but really this pandemic has brought us closer together and be able to communicate and be in each other's lives in a personal way that we didn't have before. So there is a benefit. There's another side to this. But when I'm thinking about, and one of the questions that was just brought up here is that how can a parent address the major disruptions Right now, everything that we see on television is so negative. Everything is highlighting the numbers of death, the numbers of people infected, the economy, the number of people that are losing their jobs, the long lines of people waiting for food, grocery stores running out of toilet paper. When we think about all of these things, how can a parent address these major disruptions? And when they ask this, if you can provide some ideas to create positive moments, what are some ideas for positive moments that can help a student or young person through this time? And let me go ahead and turn that to Teresa first.
Well, I think taking advantage of opportunities, like you mentioned, with technology, there are so many things we can do with technology, even in our own household. That would be a way. It's kind of using what you have. My son and I are now, my whole family, we're spending a lot more time together, obviously. Whereas when our schedules were, everybody disperses from the home and then comes back together, we all kind of had our own way of unwinding. Whereas we're together so much more now that we unwind together and build together. And I think that is probably one of the ways that families can bond is think about future things together, plan things together, think about what you're going to do when the restrictions are lifted. Are you going to go on trips? Are you going to study things? But doing those together, my son and I, we've been playing cards and watching movies, things that we haven't done for years because the technology is there. So I think just taking advantage of what you have is really one positive way. Building in celebrations, going back to the basics, getting outside and doing things outside that you haven't been able to do because of time and other demands.
Sure. Excellent. Excellent. Teresa, Kelsey, do you want to add anything to that, or can I move on to the next question matter of fact, we're really wrapping up time very quickly here. This has been very good. I really appreciate it. Again, folks, we have a list of resources and information for each and every one of you that have registered. You'll be receiving that. If you have not registered but have joined us on Facebook Live, just instant message us and we will make sure you're added to the list. And what we would need from you is just your first name and an email address. And we'll make sure you get this list of all kinds of resources that can help you. I have another question that has come in from Rachel, but before I get to that question, let me go ahead and Teresa, take your response.
I wanted to add one more thing. I think in our discussion, we're often speaking from our own standpoint, and in a large way, we can say we're speaking from a privileged standpoint. Dr. Murray, when you mentioned a moment ago about what we see on the news, people in the food lines, all of those things are really happening and really impacting people very directly. So in those families, they might not have the access to the technology. Those they might not be able to focus on fun because they're focused on survival. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to keep that in the forefront of our minds when we're having these discussions and when we're thinking about how those of us who do have we haven't lost our jobs as a result of the pandemic, what can we do maybe to assist those families? What kind of service can we do? How can we introduce our families, our children who have privilege to ways to serve those who have less? So I think that may be another way to do positive activities, but also focus on someone outside yourself.
Excellent, excellent. I appreciate it. I've got 3 more questions here that I want to make sure that I hit. One is from Mrs. Tuffy, but before I get to that question, one of the things that folks are wanting to know is, can you define what is depression and its symptoms, so that as a parent or even as a peer with another student, you can be able to know what depression is? Can any of you answer that question? You want to start with Kelsey?
Sure. I think one of the big points of depression is sadness, right? And I think it's when sadness goes beyond just being sad. And so when it's unable to be able to control your emotions of sadness, of depression, when you feel as though like you've lost interest in things, when you're starting to kind of rationalize things in a unique way. And so I think signs and symptoms of depression are kind of prevalent in our time right now. And so definitely something to look out for, but also to understand them in context and understand that if we were in a normal situation, or if this person was experiencing things outside of this pandemic, would they be feeling the same way? Would this sadness be presenting in the same fashion, and kind of understanding it that way?
Is there more than just sadness when we look at depression, Michaela?
Definitely. I think when you, as I had mentioned earlier, with any mental illness, there's, a spectrum, right? And so you can go from minor symptoms to major symptoms. Sadness, hopelessness, feelings of emptiness that begin to have significant cognitive changes that affect someone's ability to function. And so you look at, depressed mood that happens most of the day could be something that's major and every day, right? Significant decrease in interest of activities that person may, have enjoyed beforehand. Weight loss can be associated with major depression, insomnia, feelings of worthlessness. And then also that's when, reoccurrent thoughts of death and suicide can come into play as well. I think it's important too that we take depression seriously, no matter how minor or how major the symptoms may come. And if you feel as though you may have some symptoms or you're unsure, definitely reach out to a mental health professional because they'll be able to talk with you through the symptoms, through things that you're experiencing, so that way you can get the help that you need. But I also think, yes, that's it. Sorry.
No, that's perfect. And if you're in that place right now, especially as a student, and you are communicating with a school teacher, you can let that school teacher know, who will connect you to the counselor that will make sure that they refer you to the right help. You can let your doctor know. As a student, you let your parents know how you're feeling, because as I think Michaela, just to reiterate or get a better understanding of what you're just saying, I get the feeling that it can go to that extreme where suicide feels like it's the only option. And therefore, when you feel that hopelessness or feel like it's not worth it anymore, you can reach out, and there are many people there that want to help you. And as a parent, when you see these kinds of symptoms in your child, Teresa, how do you respond to it? As a parent myself, when my children were younger, if I felt that they had that kind of depression in them, I would probably panic and rush off and probably do something to an extreme. But how do you address it with your children in a way that they're open to receive it? And I know every kid is different, but in general, how would you do that?
Well, I think, again, keeping in mind the idea of mental health is health, just like physical health is health. So if you notice that there are things that seem different, change is a major hallmark that we look for. If your child seemed to be well adjusted and happy, but over the last few weeks, you've noticed the mood seems to be declining, then you should ask, be receptive to whatever response you might hear, even if it's difficult to hear. Sometimes our children will say things that are difficult for us to hear, but if it was a physical symptom, we would still hear it, we would address it, we would look for someone who could more narrowly define it so that they could get help. So I think just being a listener, being a support, and not dismissing, not imposing your any negative ideas that you may be bringing from your past experiences, but just staying open to what your young person, your child, your teen is presenting to you, and being willing to move on it. And when I say move on it, I'm meaning that to say sometimes young people will say something and you don't get a whole lot of chances to hear it. So you want to be receptive and move on it in the sense of delving in a little bit deeper when you hear it, rather than thinking, oh, I'll get back to that another time, or assessing it for yourself and saying, oh, they didn't really mean it.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Let me go ahead and move over to Mrs. Tuffy's question. She wants to know, are there measures being visited to educate people about the expected psychological impact and reactions to trauma from this pandemic? Let me read that again. Are there measures being visited to educate people about the expected psychological impact and reactions to trauma from this pandemic? And I guess from an academic standing, you know, what is your local school system doing as an educator? What are you looking at, either by yourself or by the county or the state that you're operating in? Teresa, you want to grab that first, and then if anyone else wants to jump in.
Well, I know the discussions that I've been in where they're planning ahead or looking ahead. I was in a discussion today in a meeting regarding positive behavior interventions and supports, and the discussion was around what happens when students come back and they have experienced this as a trauma. They've had loss in their family, or there's joblessness in their homes, or they've had difficulty keeping up in school. How will we manage that? And so I know that the school divisions are currently thinking about mental health as a real priority and planning for how to provide social emotional learning and mental health support as soon as we return. So that's one way. And I know that there are tons of studies probably emerging right now, really just examining. But again, I think it will go on for years.
Yeah, I think with this pandemic, it's really opened the door, and I think we don't have all the answers right now because we're going through it. And I agree with Teresa. I think there's going to be a lot of studies and a lot of things that are going to come together that will make your work probably easier in one sense, but more comprehensive in another, for each of you as you move forward here. Let me move on, because I know I want to try to wrap this up and be sensitive to everybody that has joined us, because we could talk all night about this. But let me present this question from George, and I'm going to give you a question and then a comment that he's made also. He said, what approaches would you recommend to help with active listening during someone else's trauma? And then he makes this comment. He said, it can be easy at times for us as people to attempt to relate to another person's traumas by associating it with our past issues. So what approaches would you recommend to help with active listening during someone else's trauma? And let me turn that to Michaela first.
Sure. So I definitely think that that's a common thing that many of us do when we try to listen to somebody. Oftentimes our empathy kind of goes before us too much, and we feel for what they're going through, but at the same time that feeling is only it's subjective, because it's based off of what we understand and what we've experienced. And so I think oftentimes you really have to be aware of your own perceptions when listening to somebody. And like Teresa had mentioned earlier, when active listening happens, asking clarifying questions so that way you can understand more so where that individual is coming from, rather than trying to make assumptions about, their situation based on your own understanding. And sometimes we may not even know that it's from our own understanding, right? You may say, for example, my foot hurts. Oh my goodness, you poor thing. That's awful. That's horrible. I remember a time when my foot hurt and my entire leg, and asking, oh, well, how does your foot hurt? What do you experience when that foot hurts? Instead of, assuming, well, I cried. Did you cry? No, everyone's going to experience it differently. And I know that's a simplistic analogy, but it's true in the sense of mental health. And so clarifying questions, I think, are key. And then also being aware of your own kind of cognitive understanding and your awareness of how you relate to other people, I think is extremely important.
Sure. Kelsey, can you give us a little bit of an understanding of what is active listening?
Yeah.
If you can explain that.
I think active listening, in the way that I understand it anyway, is just being attentive, being, like Michaela was saying, empathetic, giving good body language, and kind of actively participating in the conversation, really without even having to use your words, giving those clarifying questions. Not so much to, I think, looking for your response or thinking of your response in your head, but rather just being okay with listening to what that person has to say. And with that, and I'm always uncomfortable by this, but comes those awkward silences, you know, those times when it's maybe 4 or 5 seconds even where that person's thinking, you're not thinking of your own answer because we're not supposed to be doing that. And then it's just quiet. And that's okay too, because sometimes that leaves room and space to, for that other person to say, oh, and one more thing. Oh, and I was also feeling this way, which can kind of open some more doors that maybe they wouldn't have done if you would have just filled the space.
So what you're saying is that when it comes to active listening, when somebody shares something with me, instead of me trying to respond with my own experience, because then it's now about me, I need to make sure that I'm actively staying focused on them as individuals. So is that what that means, Teresa?
I would say so, yes. Staying, keeping the focus on them, even if there is a moment of sharing a personal account, making sure you don't hijack the conversation, and trying not to use, there are certain words that stop a conversation or they stop a conversation. If you grimace, or or if you say, "Oh, I would never do that," whatever it is, if we are, as I think it was Kelsey said, listening to understand rather than to respond, that you can't go wrong with that. Not saying I mastered it.
Yeah.
You can't go wrong with it.
I think all of us could probably relate to that, because we all have our own history and stories, and it's so easy to put ourselves right into that situation and forget that it's about the person that we're supposed to be actively listening. So we're about at the end of time now, but let me hit with this final question, 2-part question, and then get some closing remarks from each of you. The question is, first of all, we talked about what depression is. But what is anxiety and how does it manifest? Bada boom.
Go ahead, Kelsey. All you.
Anxiety is just intense worry, and worry when it's almost uncontrollable. And so I think it manifests harmlessly, from that idea of just something that's nagging at you to then becoming something that is taking up all of the space in your mind, that's preoccupied your thoughts and your behaviors and actions even. I think anxiety is extremely physical as well. And I think that there's, with anxiety comes panic attacks, having trouble breathing, being sweaty. And so kind of realizing all of those things, but it really boils down to those thoughts and just kind of a racing thought process of worry, of concern.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody else have anything else they'd like to add to that?
I can just expound to a little bit. Sometimes when we think of anxiety, we can oftentimes mix up fear and anxiety, and there is a difference between the two. Fear in itself, right, is the emotional response to a real or a perceived imminent threat, right, something that's actually happening. Whereas anxiety itself is that anticipation of a future threat. And so what Kelsey was talking about with that worrying and that thing that's nagging at you, it may not even be right in front of you or something that is real or perceived as an imminent threat. It's something that's an anticipation. And so that, can, again, on that spectrum, right, from excessive to, non-excessive, can affect, many people.
Okay, excellent. And Teresa, did you want to add something to that?
I was just like what Michaela was saying. I think anxiety is oriented in the future and sometimes in the past. Maybe it's some ruminating or thinking over and over about something that has happened or a perception about something that has happened. But anxiety is usually not in the present, where fear might be more in the present. So in dealing with or helping with anxiety, getting into the present and considering whatever the future thought is or the past thought is more helpful to be in the present.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Well, we're going to wrap up. We just touched the tip of the iceberg, and I want you to know that there have been super positive feedback from the audience about each of you and your comments tonight. I appreciate it. I wish we had more time to really delve deeper into this. But again, to everyone that is viewing and will be watching this, we have materials that we'll be sending out with coping mechanisms and resources that can help you. Again, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. If you need help, if you feel alone, just make that phone call, because there's somebody there that wants to help you. And with each of our panelists tonight, they care about you. And that's why they've taken the time this evening to be able to share with each and every one of you. So in closing, let me, I know I started with Kelsey and ended with Michaela. So let me start with Teresa, because she was in the middle, and ask you just for a closing comment, something positive that you would like to share with everyone regarding maybe something personal, the impact this has had, and how do we move forward with a positive mindset?
For me, this time during the pandemic has been a time of self-discovery. You know, I've learned that I am sick of cooking. That is one thing that I've learned. But I'm serious, but in all seriousness as well, it has caused me to really look inward and consider my future, consider what I'm currently doing professionally, personally, spiritually. So in a lot of ways, the time has been a gift, time to work at home, to not have to. So I'm thankful for that and try to maintain a thankful position.
Excellent, thank you. And let me turn to, should it be Michaela or Kelsey? Kelsey.
I think personally, like you were saying, Teresa, yeah, it's definitely been a time for me to just be thankful for the people in my home. And so with my fiance here, we are newly engaged and just kind of working through that. And so it's been a lot of time to just figure out what this is going to look like and kind of be able to take time to pray and be in the Word with each other. And so that's been really awesome. And then also just with my family, I think we're learning that family is such a priority for us. And so when we're not able to spend as much time as we maybe like with friends and other people in our lives, we've just been hanging out at Mom's house. And so it's been really fun to have those times together.
Sure. And Michaela.
Sure. So I think, you know, again, echoing the same sentiments about this being a time of self-discovery and realizing that I don't know how I'm going to feel comfortable putting on actual clothes to go to work again and getting out of sweatpants. And, but, you know, in all seriousness too, realizing, you know, like Kelsey was saying, you know, I'm here with my husband and, you know, it's been time for us to kind of just get to know each other on a different level. You know, we're newly married and going on 3 years. So it's just more time to do that, to discover more spiritually, to kind of dive into my word, to pray. And I think one of the key takeaways that I constantly tell myself and that I hope everyone understands is that you're not alone. There is someone there. There are resources. There's coping strategies that can be shared, music, taking a walk, whatever the case may be, talking with a friend. So just reach out if you need help, but know that you're not alone and we are all in this together in some way.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Teresa. Appreciate you so much. Kelsey, Michaela, thank you, each of you, for being a part of this tonight. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us, a seat at the table with Dr. Paul Murray. I appreciate you being here. Again, for everyone that has registered, we will be sending you a thank you note along with all of the resources that we have compiled together to help you. And if you did not register and you joined us on Facebook Live, please instant message us with your name and your email address, and we'll make sure that you're included in this list of resources that will be very helpful for you. And you want to hold on to it, because you may not need it now, but the next crisis, the next issue, it could be personal, it could be public, that could come up that have an impact on you, where you trip and say, how did I find myself here? You have some resources that you can turn to. So again, thank you to our audience. Thank you to each of you tonight, and wishing you all the best. And we're in the state of Maryland. We've just moved into phase 1. To move out of this pandemic situation. And so our prayers is that this nation will get through this, and quickly, but safely. So again, good night to all of you, and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.